idealism prevails. Make the world a better place.
Hello and welcome. Today we want to talk about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which is, and I think I can speak for all of us, rather underrepresented in at least the German-speaking news, although it has the potential for a major international crisis. Our guest is Professor Gerhard Mangott, Professor for International Affairs and profound expert on Russia and Ukraine. My name is Chris, and I will conduct this interview together with my colleague Sasha, who currently resides in the Czech Republic. Good morning to all of you.
Good morning.
I think it's good in the beginning that we start at the beginning. Let's look back to 2014 when everything started and what happened until today. Maybe you can give us a short summary.
Well, the crisis over Ukraine started back in 2013 when Russia and the European Union tried to win over Ukraine for their integration projects. The European Union had pushed forward its Eastern Partnership program, bringing Eastern European countries, actually Western and Southern neighbors of Russia, into a closer economic and political partnership with the European Union. And Russia sought to integrate Ukraine in its own integration effort, the Eurasian Union. So there was a very strong integration rivalry between the two, between Russia and the European Union. And the fact that the government of Ukraine sided with the Russians eventually caused a major mass protest in Kiev and in other places of Ukraine. And at the end of these protests, actually, there was sort of a revolt, of some say it, a coup d'etat to a certain extent, which brought into power a Western-leaning government. So actually, with this new government in place, seeking NATO membership, seeking EU membership, Russia had actually lost this integration rivalry with the European Union. And in order to win over at least some strategic positions in Ukraine, Russia decided to invade Crimea, to occupy Crimea, to annex Crimea, and also was very helpful and supportive for a revolt in eastern parts of Ukraine against the new government, a very much disliked new government in Kiev. So indeed, Russia was and is responsible for the military escalation of the Ukraine crisis. But not only Russia is to blame for it, but the European Union as well. Also, the European countries have contributed to the escalation of this crisis. What we have had since then is that Russia has positioned more and more troops and heavy weaponry on Crimea, and that the separatist movement supported by Russia financially, logistically, militarily, and even with some own Russian forces is still in a conflict with the Ukrainian government, and all efforts to solve the Eastern Ukrainian crisis, the peace efforts of Minsk, have failed so far because neither side was willing to implement all the obligations foreseen in these two documents about solving the Eastern Ukrainian crisis.
Thank you. May I come in just a second? I would like to take a step back further, actually, if you assist me and correct me. Just the Ukraine is the second largest country on the European landmass and has around 42 million population. Is that correct? Yeah. Please let's talk a little bit about maybe the how the population is made up, because I think it's around 72% Ukrainians, around 17 to 20% Russians, and then you know, and then a few others. What has that got to do with this particular conflict? That would be my first question, and I'd like to get back then to the history. So how is the inner Ukrainian situation responsible for this conflict right now?
Well, Ukraine is made up of 26 regions, and only in just one region, namely Crimea, the ethnic Russian population is in a majority position. 62% of the Crimean population in 2014 actually were ethnic Russians. In all other regions, Russians are a sizable minority when it comes to the east and to the south of Ukraine. And if we include Russian speakers in these regions, then there's a substantial group of non-Ukrainians in eastern and southern Ukraine. However, we have no ethnic Russian majority in any other of Ukraine's regions except for Crimea.
Thank you. If I may, which is of course been preparing a little bit for today, I found it incredibly interesting how the Ukraine is related to both Russia and Western Europe. Like as an Austrian, I mean, we're all Austrians here. And until a friend of mine had a project in Chernovitz, I didn't actually really realize how close the Ukraine was to us and how deeply connected we in Central Europe have been to the Ukraine. Could you please expand on that a little bit, the relationship of the Ukraine to Western Europe and then possibly to Russia within the historical context?
Well, actually, Ukraine has not existed in its current borders as a sovereign independent state. It was for the first time in 1991 that Ukraine became a sovereign state with its current borders. Over the history, Ukraine has been, ruled by various nations and empires, by the Russian Empire, by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but also by the Austrian and Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So various parts of Ukraine have been part of different empires.
Sorry, may I intercede? Pardon me for being rude. Ottoman Empire was part of that as well. I'm just asking whether the Turks have a piece in that as well.
Well, if we go back in history quite a long time, then yes, the Ottoman Empire controlled Crimea, the peninsula of Crimea. Crimea itself has been occupied by Russia only in 1783 by Tsar Catherine the Great, and since then Crimea had been part of the Russian Empire, and later the Soviet Union. And within the Soviet Union, Crimea was part of the Russian Union Republic until it was actually transferred to Ukraine by the communist leader of the Soviet Union in 1954. So for a very long time, Crimea had belonged to Russia, and particularly its role in various wars, particularly in World War II, Sevastopol, the main city of the Crimean Peninsula, is considered to be, well, really true Russia. It is a hero city in Russia's history and has ever been considered by the Russian population and its elites as intrinsically Russian.
Thank you.
Okay.
Chris, you want to get in there?
As we already spoke about majorities and minorities in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin claimed that there is possible genocide about to happen in in the Donbas region especially. What do you think about this claim? Is it realistic, or is it just to justify any plans he maybe has for the future?
Well, actually, Putin's claim about the genocide or something similar to a genocide, as he said, is absurd. We don't have any actually features of a genocide happening in eastern Ukraine. What we do have is that after the Western-leaning governments took over in 2014, the ethnic Ukrainian identity of Ukraine has been strengthened considerably. This means that the Russian minority, but also other majorities like the Hungarian majority, have now a more difficult life in the current Ukraine than they had previously, before 2014. So of course there has been a setback for Russian culture, for Russian influence, for Russian media in Ukraine, for the Russian language in Ukraine. But I would never argue that the ethnic Russians are discriminated against in Ukraine in a considerable manner, and calling it a genocide actually is, as I said, absurd. It could, however, been used as a pretext for a military escalation in the separatist regions by the Russian Federation?
Maybe let's throw this in there right now, and we can then branch off from there. You mentioned the possibility of that escalation, and the possibility of that escalation is also why we are talking right now, I guess. In the last few days, in various media outlets, certainly in Germany, we have seen videos popping up from population along the Ukrainian-Russian border on the Russian side, where apparently not only heavy machinery is being moved, but also ambulances and such, to which a NATO official said, we're never worried if they are moving tanks around, because that's all right, that they can be stored anywhere, but we are getting worried when ambulances are being moved around. Just straight off the cuff, do you think there's a more than 50% likelihood that this conflict is actually going to turn hot, as quite a few people also here in the Czech Republic and amongst my Polish expert friends are saying that it is indeed likely that in the new year it will go hot?
I don't think it is likely, but there is a chance of a military escalation. So far, I think this troop build-up by the Russians, including all the heavy weaponry, the soldiers, the ambulances, the logistics, and what have you, is meant to give credibility to Russian demands vis-a-vis the United States and NATO. Putin and other Russian officials have made it clear over the past 2.5 months what they expect NATO and the United States to do, namely to refrain from further expanding NATO to the east, which of course very much refers to Ukraine and Georgia. And the Russians also demand that NATO does not actually build military infrastructure in Ukraine, which could be eventually used as an offensive platform, a military offensive platform against the Russian Federation. What the Russians are worrying about is that they, of course, know that NATO membership for Ukraine or for Georgia, for that matter, is not on the table now. But what they see that is happening is that NATO countries are cooperating with the Ukrainian side in such a manner that Ukraine is almost a NATO member country, except for the formal membership in the alliance. And the Russians want to have that stopped. And these are the Russian red lines put forward by the Russian leadership over the past weeks. And in order to increase the importance and relevance of Russia's demands, I think this troop buildup has been orchestrated. I do not think that yet there has been a decision by the Russian leadership to start a war against Ukraine in whatever matter and form. But the problem is, if the West, if NATO and the United States do not respond properly to the Russian demands, which is very unlikely, then actually Vladimir Putin is in a difficult situation. What will he do in such a situation? Will he say, okay, yes, we tried to get some concessions, we failed, so everything is fine again? Or will he threaten to be losing face, then start a military escalation? So the major issue at hand now is that we should indeed have very close talks, maybe even negotiations between Russia and the West about Russia's security concerns, but also about Ukraine's and Western security concerns. If these talks do not start, or if they fail early, there is a greater threat of military escalation than I see at the moment.
One of these platforms of the talks could be the Normandy format. During preparation for today, I read that Russia is avoiding this format for quite some time. Is this true? And when, and if it's true, why is Russia avoiding it? I mean, for the explanation, it's France, Germany, Russia, and Ukraine who are in this. platform?
Well, the Normandy format was launched in June 2014, and it was supported by the United States, but the administration of Obama at that time wanted Europeans to solve the problem in Ukraine. So that's why the United States did not engage in that format. So it was a European exercise in trying to solve the military conflict in eastern Ukraine. And actually, we do have an agreement, the Minsk II agreement from February 2015, which could be a pathway to a long-term solution of the separatist conflict. However, neither side has been implementing the obligations under this Minsk II agreement to the relevant extent. Neither do we have a sustainable and comprehensive ceasefire, an exchange of all prisoners of war, and the withdrawal of heavy weaponry from the security zone on both sides of the line of control between the Ukrainian and the separatist armed forces, nor has Ukraine actually implemented its political obligations that it signed in February 2015 in the Minsk II agreement. These obligations are to change or to revise the Ukrainian constitution to provide for more decentralization. These obligations include the passage of an amnesty law for the separatist fighters by the Ukrainian parliament. And above all, Ukraine has promised in that agreement to grant permanent special status, a sort of special autonomy to the separatist regions. Ukraine has not lived up to any of these obligations. And the Russians are saying, well, if they do not, then what is the sense of proceeding with Normandy? And here we have to know that the Ukrainian side has always argued, and particularly under the current government of President Zelensky, that they expect the military part of the Minsk II agreement to be implemented first, so a comprehensive and sustainable ceasefire. And only then would Ukraine actually take steps to live up to its obligations under Minsk II. And in this respect, the Ukrainian leadership has always been supported by Germany and France. However, in the past year, the Zelensky government in Kiev has put more and more doubt on its acceptance of the Minsk II agreement. They have said what we need is another agreement because Minsk II was actually very, very detrimental to Ukrainian interests. So the Ukrainian government has signaled that they would like not to stick any longer to Minsk II. And this has been received in Moscow very negatively. And in addition to casting doubt on the agreement from 2015, the Ukrainian government has argued that the format should be changed, that the United States should be included, maybe also the United Kingdom, which is also to the dislike of the Russian side. So given these new developments over the past year, the Russians have lost interest in proceeding with mid-Normandy talks. What they do is they expect Ukraine to take steps in the implementation of its obligations, and then only then to proceed with high-level conversations within the Normandy format.
Considering that and all the other aspects, maybe we should take a closer look, as you are here and you're such an expert on the situation, we should take a closer look on what might be the scenario of a conflict and why we should urge all political forces in Europe as far as we can to engage in more intensive security talks with the Russians. Now, the Ukraine has, according to my research, the third largest army on the European landmass after Russia and France. There is also the situation with the Poles, for example, the Lithuanians, Estonians, and so on and so forth, who are also becoming Georgians, you mentioned before, that are becoming or have been quite uneasy with what they perceive as Russia's, Putin's expansionist intentions. Can we have any idea of what an armed conflict so close, I don't think it's 500 kilometers from where we're sitting, could really, what kind of shape it could take, and what NATO is supposed to do, or we as Europeans are supposed to do? What could that be? What kind of conflict could we expect there?
Well, what NATO has been doing so far is, or say individual member countries of NATO, is to send weaponry to Ukraine, modern, even offensive weaponry. Unlike Obama, Trump has started delivering, for instance, Javelin anti-tank missiles to Ukraine. Other NATO countries like Poland and Lithuania have sent weapons to Ukraine as well. And NATO countries, including the United States, are training and assisting the Ukrainian armed forces and doing joint military exercises with the Ukrainian armed forces. And with all of this, the Ukrainian army now is much stronger than it was in 2014, when it was actually smashed by the Russian side, which had a much more modern, much more effective military strike force than Ukraine had at the time. So the military positions, the military posture of Ukraine is now very much different from 2014. So this would mean that Russia would, of course, win such a conflict, maybe even quite quickly, but this military escalation by Russia would be much more costly than the 2014 operations have been. We would have a lot of casualties on the Russian side. Many soldiers would actually perish in such a conflict. And if the Russians actually try to invade parts of Ukraine, I don't think, and I don't expect a full invasion of all of Ukraine, but if they invade certain parts of Ukraine, like the southern Ukraine linking up the separatist regions with the peninsula of Crimea, then it would also be very difficult for a victorious Russian army to keep order and keep control over the newly occupied areas. There would be definitely strong popular resistance, sort of a partisan resistance to the Russian occupation. However, actually, we do not know what kind of military operation the Russians are planning. Will it be limited strikes by missiles? Will it be cyber strikes to wipe out the infrastructure of Ukraine? Would they expand just a bit in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, to expand the territory of the separatist regions? Or will it be a much broader operation, as I said, to take control of southern Ukraine, to create a land bridge between the separatist territories in the Donbass and the peninsula of Crimea, which would be very helpful in various respects for the Russian side. So actually, we do not know what kind of war scenario Russia currently is planning. That's very unfortunate, but that's the thing we have to accept at the moment. We don't know indeed the Russian intentions, and we don't neither politically nor militarily. And in such a situation, as you've said, it's very important to enter into talks to clarify the picture and sort out the alternatives we have to a military escalation.
Does this muscle weaving also have to do something with Nord Stream 2? Because we know for now the main pipelines are going through from Russia to Europe, are going through Ukraine. And if Nord Stream 2 starts, then there's another way, or another very important way for Russian gas coming into Europe. So is he maybe also flexing his muscles to show us that Nord Stream 2 should be implemented?
Well, of course, the Russian leadership has a very strong interest that Nord Stream 2 gets certified by the Deutsche Bundesnetzagentur and by the European Commission, and gas starts flowing within the next year. However, I do think the military buildup around Ukraine has nothing to do with Nord Stream 2. What the Russians have signaled with Nord Stream 2 and also with Nord Stream 1, which which was commissioned actually in 2011 and 2012, is to find a way to transport its gas to the major European customer, namely Germany, bypassing Ukraine. They are bypassing, or they want to bypass it, because they do not want to prop up the government in Kiev, because Kiev earns quite a lot of money in transit fees for Russian gas exports to Europe currently, between $2 and $3 billion US. So the Russians are interested in depriving Ukraine of this revenue. And the Russians also do not want to be dependent on Ukraine as regards the transit of its gas exports to European customers. So for the Russian side, it's both rationally, economically and financially, but also politically and geopolitically. In the European Union, however, Nord Stream 2 is very much contested. And what we have seen over the past 2 weeks is that the current coalition government in Germany is not united on what to do with Nord Stream 2. We have heard so many statements by various members of the current German government about what they think the future of Nord Stream should be. And these are not coherent statements. These are very diverging statements. And that is actually weakening the outlook for Nord Stream to get implemented over the next 6 to 8 months.
Yeah, thank you. That's actually really important. And I would like to look now into more proactive scenarios that we could discuss. Now, from your point of view, the Ukraine is I think number 74 on the list of developing nations. So it's actually it's the poorest after Moldavia, again on the European landmass. Considering all that has been said until now, what would you suggest could be the role? And I say now of the European Union, considering how many fractions there are, but what could and should be, especially considering that France is now taking over the approach of the European Union vis-a-vis the Ukraine, especially again considering how much need there is in the population.
Well, the European Union over the past 7 years has pumped a lot of money into Ukraine, billions of euros into Ukraine to keep the economy alive, to keep the financial system intact, and actually making Ukraine survive. And the European Union will have to continue with this financial support, which is paralleled by US financial support, but in the US case, mainly military support. The European Union will have to continue with this support, either bilaterally, EU member states supporting Ukraine, or on the level of the European institutions, or via international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, in close coordination, of course, with the United States and some other countries like Canada, for instance. So Ukraine will remain a financial burden for the European Union. But the European Union has decided that for geopolitical reasons, it's worth it. It's worth to pump all these billions into the Ukrainian economy. The European Union, however, from the very start has made these support linked with democratic reforms, the strengthening of the rule of law in Ukraine, and the fight against corruption. However, Ukraine has not made very much progress on this front. Ukraine is much more democratic than Russia is, but Ukraine is not a democracy. It's more pluralist, but it's not a real democracy. It's only starting to democratize. And we don't even know whether Ukraine will continue on this path to further democratization. There could be a reverse developments somewhere in the next years. It's still possible. So what the European Union has been doing is linking the support with Ukrainian political reforms. However, in practice, what I have observed over the past 7 years is that the Western creditors of Ukraine are much too lenient on Ukraine. They are ready, when push comes to shove, to send the money to Kiev, even if Kiev does not actually live up to all what they have promised to do in the arena of political reform and democratization. But Ukraine will remain a burden for the European Union, yes, and Ukraine will not become a member of the European Union. That's also quite clear, to the disappointment of the Ukrainian government and much of the Ukrainian population. The association agreement that has been signed between the European Union and Ukraine in 2014 builds or creates a strong, as it is called, deep and comprehensive free trade area and a political convergence between Ukraine and the European Union. But there is no membership perspective, and there will for the foreseeable future, say for the next 10 to 20 years, no membership perspective for Ukraine. So this is a bit a tricky situation. A lot of financial support and political support for Ukraine, but no commitment to include Ukraine in the list of potential members of the European Union in the future.
So may I tag onto that? So let's look at the second part of this equation. Now, vis-a-vis Russia, to me, it always feels Europe is between a rock and the hard place, as they say, with Russia. On the one hand, we ought to, make a stand and act a little tougher, maybe, towards the advances that Putin is making in his expansionist policies. On the other hand, I think we all know we're fairly dependent on Russia, not only in terms of energy, but certainly in terms of its proximity to us, much more than, in my humble opinion, than to the Americans who are across the Atlantic. So my question is this: in your opinion, being very knowledgeable about the Russian internal situation as well and the European, what ought to be the European approach and behavior towards Putin? And I think it has a lot to do with Putin. I think Russia and Putin are still separate, and there's stuff going on internally as well. Maybe you could speak to that also. So again, how ought we to behave as Europeans towards Russia under Putin?
Well, actually, the European Union has agreed on the so-called 5 guiding principles in its policy vis-a-vis Russia in 2016, which includes selective engagement with Russia, selective cooperation, but also demands that the EU member countries' resilience towards Russian aggression should be improved, that people-to-people contact between the EU member countries and Russia should be strengthened, that the European Union will even more closely cooperate with Russia's western and southern neighbors. And currently we can say that the the Russia policy of the European Union is based on three terms, namely the European Union with its pushback commitment has made it clear that whenever Russia takes steps that the European Union dislikes and does not approve of, the European Union will try to strike back politically, diplomatically, but maybe also in the terms of sanctions, economic and financial sanctions. The second term that is widely used now in the European Union when it comes to the Russia policy of the Union is constrainment. That means the European Union should do whatever it can to weaken the financial and material potential of Russia for conducting even further aggressive, even a more aggressive foreign policy on the Russian side. And the third term that is used is that selective engagement. So pushback, constrainment, and selective engagement now characterizes the position of the European Union vis-a-vis Russia. The problem is that Russia does not take the European Union as a serious actor. For the Russian side, for the Russian elites, the European Union is maybe powerful in the economic and financial field, but in its foreign policy and in its security policy, it is not considered as a relevant actor. Actually, the Russian leadership at the moment sees the European Union as a coalition of countries that are vassals to the United States. And so for the Russians, the argument is, why actually talk to the European Unions if they do not have a sovereign and independent political position, but are actually just an appendix to the United States? So I talk to them, isn't it better, and that's what the Russians are doing and demanding, to talk to the United States directly? Because only the United States will decide how the Europeans will behave. And that is what one of the difficult moments now in the bilateral relationship between the European Union and Russia. Russia doesn't want to talk to you. It doesn't consider Europe relevant. And actually it's fed up with the normative foreign policy of the European Union, very much interested in issues like democracy, rule of law, human rights, and the like. That's not what the Russians want to talk about. Not with the Europeans, and not even with the United States. What the Russians want to do is talk about security in Europe, the security architecture in Europe, but not with the Europeans, but with the United States. Mr. Borrell, the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy of the European Union, has mentioned 2 days ago that the Europeans wanted to be part of the talks between Russia and the United States about the European security architecture. And the Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia has responded yesterday saying, well, we do appreciate different opinions, but actually talking about the new security structure, we only want with the United States, not with the Europeans. So there was a very, very robust rejection of any EU attempt to play a role in the ongoing negotiation process between the United States and the Russian Federation.
Well, thank you. And I was sorry, Chris, but the last one now to this, the triumvirate question, so to speak. Now you just mentioned it. When we look at the US situation, that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because certainly since under Obama continued with Trump just more openly, the US has, I would say, retreated somewhat, certainly from the European and the NATO situation, as far as I can tell. The NATO is very expensive for the US, and as we all know, they have enough trouble domestically and with China maybe and various other conflicts that they're engaged in. It is my personal feeling, knowing a little bit about the internals there, that the interest has waned since the Second World War. What would you expect the US to do? Because I would honestly say that I do not see the US taking a really active, apart from rhetorically, a very active role against Russia should it come to any escalation. But what is your opinion on the US, NATO? Trump was very vocal about what he expected, certainly the Europeans to do. And Biden, or maybe he could do with a conflict. I don't want to speculate. Maybe it would help him domestically. But anyway, we're in the realm of speculation. But what is your opinion concerning the role of the US in this particular situation?
Well, what we have seen since about 2011, 2012, so still under the Obama administration, was sort of a reorientation, or it was called a rebalancing of US geopolitical interests from Europe and the Middle East to the Asia-Pacific region. Obama called it a pivot to Asia. And the national security and the national defense strategy of the United States from 2017 and 2018 actually claim that China and Russia are the main adversaries and rivals and competitors of the US, and the rivalry between these great powers is the new actually security context in which the United States has to assign its policies. Well, indeed, the United States had tried to get more distance from the European theater, taking no longer the ultimate responsibility for European security, demanding more contributions from its European allies, asking for more military capacity of its European allies so that the Europeans themselves could confront an aggressive Russia. And also in the Middle East, already under Obama, but also under Donald Trump, the United States wanted to get a lot more distance and much less responsibility for what happens in the region, to focus and concentrate on China and the Indo-Pacific region. However, developments over the past years have made it actually very difficult for the United States to proceed with this reorientation of its foreign policy, because now we do have a clear Russian threat vis-a-vis Ukraine. There's a threat of military escalation. And this actually forces the United States to recommit to European security, although they, like every other NATO member country, will not send any soldiers to Ukraine to fight against the Russians in the case of a military conflict. And also in the Middle East, the United States had tried to extricate itself much more than it had been over the past 30 years. The conflict with Iran about its nuclear program, about its potential military design, and the rivalries between the Western-friendly Gulf monarchies and Iran in the Persian Gulf have forced the United States, have forced Biden to recommit stronger to the region than it actually had intended before. So what we see is the US would like not to leave the European and Middle Eastern theater, but to disengage to a certain extent. But events in these two regions actually do not allow the United States to proceed with these plans. And the United States is not happy about it because it actually understands focusing on the European Union, on the European theater and the Middle Eastern theater takes resources, financial resources, political resources, military resources that the United States cannot invest in its competition, in its rivalry with China. And that's actually something that most of the foreign policy establishment of the United States doesn't like, but there's actually at the moment no alternative than to stay recommitted in both theaters, Europe and the Middle East.
As you both already mentioned China, is there a possibility that China and Russia are working together on this opposition against the United States? As we all know, there are high tensions in the South China Sea between China and between China and Taiwan. Is there a possibility that those two are working together, or is this just speculation?
Well, what we have seen over the past years, particularly since 2018, is that there's a very, very close alignment between China and Russia. It's not an alliance, let alone a military alliance, but both sides are coordinating their positions very, very closely, politically, diplomatically. We have on very many occasions a similar decision-making process by China and Russia in the Security Council. They are opposed to the Western concept of humanitarian intervention. They both support a very traditional understanding of state sovereignty, which actually rules out what they call the meddling in internal affairs. They are working closely together in the economic field, in the military field. They do have joint military exercises, joint patrols. Russia is selling a lot of weaponry to the Chinese side. They have coordinated somewhat their positions as far as the South China Sea is concerned, about Russia's position vis-a-vis its Western and Southern neighbors is concerned. Well, yes, there is indeed a very close alignment, and it's also based, but that's not the reason why it actually has evolved so strongly over the past years, but they are also based, these relations are also based on a very strong personal relationship between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. But even if they would actually step down or be recalled from office, the mutual interests of Russia and China are so strong that even under a new leadership, this close alignment will continue, except for, say, a regime change revolution in Russia or in China, which can be ruled out for the foreseeable future. So yes, this is a very close, coordinated relationship between the two countries. They do understand that they are both under pressure from the United States and the West. They try to agree on a very strong counter-strike position to actually fend off US and European incursions on Chinese and Russian interests in the various theaters. As far as the South China Sea is concerned, however, Russia has not been arguing like the Chinese that these islands and others are part of Chinese territory. The Russian position is only that this question about where the borders are to be drawn in the South China Sea is a matter only for regional countries and not for countries from outside the arena, so not for the United States or for the Europeans. And China, on the other hand, has not actually agreed to Crimea as a part of the Russian Federation. They didn't like what the Russians did in 2014, because the Chinese are afraid of separatism as well, in Tibet, in Xinjiang, in Taiwan. So separatism that happened in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea by Russia is not something that the Ukrainians would like to see, the Chinese would like to see, because this could happen to them as well. So the Chinese have not acknowledged Crimea to be part of Russia, but they have shown a lot of understanding for the Russian actions. And actually, only a couple of days ago, the Chinese leadership signaled that it does understand the Russian actions around Ukraine, the military buildup, as a means to fend off Western offensive intentions, militarily offensive intentions on the Western borders of Russia, as the Russians see it.
Okay. You have any further questions?
I would round it off. I not really a question, but I would return it. This was really interesting. And we cut this now anyway. Yeah? Poroshenko, who was the previous before the current Ukrainian president, as far as I remember, apparently left the country a couple of days ago, the Ukraine, because there is apparently, he's been accused of treason for apparently supporting the rebellion in the Donbass with money, which he siphoned from energy deals. I don't know whether that is true or not, but my question would be this, as to round this up, our conversation. You mentioned that one of the most problematic aspects of Ukrainian politics is corruption, as in many countries that is in such a sensitive state. Now, in your opinion, because also in Austria, we do have a little bit of that. So, as an expert in politics, what can be done vis-a-vis that level of corruption in countries from the outside? So we are paying billions in, but only a fraction is actually arriving at the needy population. So that appears to me to be one of the main problems in the majority of those conflicts. It ultimately always leads to that. So do you have any advice, any idea of what could be done to stem systemic corruption?
Well, I think conditionality should be strengthened very strongly, meaning that Western support is based and linked to efforts by the Ukrainian government to go after corruption within the bureaucracy, the courts, the police, and of course in the economic arena. Ukraine under Poroshenko, but also under Zelensky, has not made very encouraging steps to wipe out corruption. Corruption is still a problem. And I think this is due to the fact that this conditionality by the Western side is not strong enough, namely linking support for concrete steps to wipe out corruption. And that is a tricky political situation because Ukraine is always claiming we must not fail as a state because we are under Russian threats. And if Ukraine fails, Russia will win over Ukraine for its sphere of influence. And that's also the calculation on the Western side. We should put pressure on Ukraine, but ultimately our major goal is not fighting against corruption and establishing the rule of law, but our major goal is to make Ukraine a success story. This, of course, includes efforts in democratizing Ukraine, but at the very end of the day, what is relevant for the West is that Ukraine survives as a state. And that actually weakens conditionality. That has led to decisions that financial resources are delivered to Kiev, despite lacking substantial progress of the Ukrainian government in pushing forward the rule of law and the fight against corruption. And that is actually a very, very negative arrangement. Conditionality, which should be very strong, is weakened by the overall geopolitical interest of the Western countries to keep Ukraine alive and to keep it outside the Russian sphere of influence. And with that, actually, the Ukrainian governments have a lot of leeway. They can always argue, if you push too hard, if you don't support us financially, and not to the extent we want you to support us, we will actually collapse. And then what will happen is that the Russians will take us over, and that should not be and cannot be in the interest of the Western countries. And that is actually the mechanism, that is the political mechanism or the political setup is between the West and Ukraine, which actually weakens and undermines progress in democratization.
Thank you. Just for the gamblers out there, do we dare to predict what's going to happen? I don't know, I'm a little bit negative at the moment. I see a 70-30 for a Russian hot war at the border before April. Are we going to, when we meet next time, are we going to have moved in any direction? Do you see any indication to diffuse the situation, or do you rather see arguments for my dire prediction?
Well, actually, Russia is in sort of a time pressure. If they really want to invade Ukraine, there will be a ground invasion. They need to do it in January or February when the surface is frozen. They can't actually launch an offensive in April or May, right, for that very reason. So the Russians actually are under time pressure, and they need to get substantial concessions by the West in the forthcoming negotiations. Well, the format of these negotiations is still not yet defined, but I do not think that the West will be forthcoming. The NATO General Secretary has made his statements. Various member countries of NATO have made their statements. The United States has ruled out major demands of the Russian Federation. So I do not expect the talks to be very fruitful and very cooperative. So we could actually see these talks fail in a very early stage, and then Russia would strike militarily to underline the relevance of its red lines and to push for more concessions from the West. This could be a limited military strike, but as I've said, for various reasons, it needed to be started in late January or in February. So indeed, there is a possibility, I would say, of 50-50. Well, that's very convenient, of course, a 50-50 probability of military escalation. And I think it will strengthen by the day if the talks between the West and Russia don't actually produce results. And the expectation on my side is that we won't see any substantial results in these talks quite quickly, if ever. And so this would, say, by the end of January and February, raise the likelihood of a Russian invasion up to 70-75%, I'd say.
Thank you. You, as an expert, of course, behooves you well to be conservative. We may throw things around. Thank you very much for your time from my side. And I do hope we meet again, maybe next time, to take a closer look at Europe and the mess it's in, and subsequently maybe China, who knows, that's up to the colleagues. So thank you very much indeed. And I'm looking forward to seeing you again. Be well. And Veseli Vánoce, as we say here.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having. It was a very interesting experience to talk to both of you.
Thanks too from my side, and all the best for our viewers, and Merry Christmas, and probably, hopefully, Happy New Year to everyone, to all of you, and we will meet again at this station.
Idealism prevails. Make the world a better place.